In the meantime, in the 5 years, a lot of the Russian Navy was actually rebuilt in America.
Yeah.
And when Admiral Stepan Lisovsky showed up in New York, September of 1863, and Admiral Andrei Popov shows up in San Francisco in October of 1863, part of the ships that they were on and the guns were American made. And both admirals actually had friends on the East Coast and the West Coast, respectively.
Hello and welcome to Stand Up Historian. This is our third episode of series which we're talking about relationship between the United States and Russia from the American Revolution. We discussed the American Revolution and the role of Catherine the Great during that time, which by not providing assistance to George III, in fact, indirectly supported American revolutionaries in their amazing success and creation of the United States. We moved forward to the War of 1812 when President Madison underestimated the power of, at the time, British superpower and decided to start a war which proved to be very unwise. And this time also it was Russia that stepped in, and by supporting American side and putting out the fires of White House, in fact, they helped America to survive, literally survive that war and continue. So this has been a good relationship so far, this 50 years period that we're talking about. Now we are past 1812, War of 1812. We want to see what happened between 1812 until the Civil War of 1861. And my good friend, technologist and historian, Alexei Palladin is here, and we are going to discuss the years after 1812 and the relationship between the young United States of America and Russia with its very ambitious czars, it seems like, right?
Yes. Grosh, thank you very much for having me back,
my pleasure.
Thank you, and to all the thousands of viewers who've seen the previous two episodes. Thank you for doing that. This is a continuation of the story, and I promise I'll get us to the United States Civil War of 1861 and onwards fairly quickly. But I do want to talk about things that happened between 1812, actually 1825, and 1861, just to provide some context.
Please.
Now, one thing that I do not want our listeners to think is that everything was just rosy all the time between the United States and Russia. It's a relationship. It's a relationship of a nascent nation, a nation that is growing fast and establishing itself, the United States, and Russia, that is also becoming a superpower. After the wars of 1812, Russia had asserted itself of the same stature as Great Britain and France, or had the ambition to be. And yet, it continued to support the United States because that level of support came very naturally. We were looking at actually two powers growing in two hemispheres, and they did not have any conflicting interest. They actually had a lot in common, and the interest was based primarily on trade. Now, there were some issues. And around 1820, the Russian-American Company was becoming very assertive. It was one of the largest privately owned businesses in the Russian Empire and actually in Europe. And they were starting to meddle with policy,
Of course.
which irritated Alexander I. Their ambition spanned not only across what we now know as the state of Alaska, but they were looking down south. They had established Fort Ross, and to our listeners and viewers, if you have an opportunity, please do visit Fort Ross State Park in the state of California, a wonderful museum with a lot of resources about the history. It was an agricultural colony and yet a presence in California, and the Russians even had ambitions going as far as Hawaii. On the island of Kauai today, you can find Fort Elizabeth State Park by the state of Hawaii, which was established by Russians as an outpost. The Russian-American company wanted to actually see if they could start annexing territories between Alaska and California. And this came in conflict with what the United States wanted to achieve with the Oregon territories.
Oh.
So Secretary of State John Quincy Adams found himself in a situation where he had to resolve this. And he did, knowing very well not only Alexander I, but also the Minister of Foreign Affairs and key players in St. Petersburg. He found a palatable way. And they signed what was known as the Convention of April of 1824, which basically regulated things, where Russians would deal with Americans in a certain way. But it also opened up new opportunities. Russians and Americans could now visit each other's country and move freely between the two nations with any objection or any need for any additional documentation and such. And that laid the groundwork for future developments. So 1824, 1825, 50 years period from 1775, good relations, good trade, good economies, and good benefits for both
So I have a
nations.
question here.
Yes.
You are talking about the foundation of good relationship was economy. It seems like always commerce makes these relationships to last longer and be more benevolent relationships. But was there any other reason for Russia to open such a huge account of friendship with the United States, such as stopping the British power, French power, and having an ally on this side to create a balance between the forces of that time and also politics of the time, so have something against Anglo-Saxons?
Kurosh, you're a wonderful historian with a great appreciation for geopolitics and dynamics. And commerce led the way. And there were great interests by American businesses to sell more to Russia, Russians to sell to the United States. But it was also something that Tsar Nicholas I told to the American ambassador, Ambassador Dallas, in 1837, when they met in St. Petersburg.
Mm-hmm.
The ambassador introduced himself, and he was surprised that a few days after arrival, the Tsar threw him a banquet, invited all the special guests. And as they were speaking, the ambassador said, well, our relationship is based on this mutual understanding and benefit. And the Tsar acknowledged. And then, and by the way, Nicholas, like his brother Alexander I, spoke English.
Oh, okay.
And Nicholas spoke and said the following. He agreed with the U.S. ambassador and said, not only are our commercial interests aligned, but then with emphasis of tone, he said, but our enemies are alike. Commerce,
Yes.
enemies, and threats. At that point in time, the British Empire and the French, which was going from revolution back to monarchy
Yes,
and back and
yes,
forth.
that-
And we're going to talk about Napoleon III
Definitely.
and his role very quickly. They were seen by both nations on two hemispheres as their natural enemies in between, those who were meddling with the affairs. And speaking of those nations, I just want to quote from a famous historian, Alexei de Tocqueville, who wrote in 1835 in Democracy in America, there are now two great nations in the world which, starting from different points, seem to be advancing toward the same goal, the Russians and the Anglo-Americans. Each seems called by some secret design of providence, one day to hold in its hands the destinies of the world.
This is profound. 1835.
1835.
Nearly 200 years ago.
1835, yes. So what was happening to help with that relationship and embolden that relationship? The continuation of diplomacy as manifested in something that, typically they say history doesn't repeat itself, it rhymes. But in this instance, it actually repeated itself. Because as we remember from the story of John Quincy Adams,
Yes.
ambassador to Russia, Secretary of State, President of the United States, guess what happened to James Buchanan? James Buchanan was a emerging politician from Pennsylvania in the early 1830s. He supported President Jackson. Buchanan's ambition was actually to be vice president on the ticket of President Jackson.
Uh-huh.
Martin Van Buren was selected
Yes.
for that role. And as a honor and as a favor of sorts, President Jackson decided to send Buchanan to St. Petersburg. Again, seen by Jackson, like Madison, as a critical post with a very specific task. So 1824, they signed an agreement between Russia with the thanks of John Quincy Adams and the United States. But President Jackson wanted to expand upon that. And surprisingly, in just 18 months of Buchanan's ambassadorship, a new trade agreement was put in place, an agreement on commerce and navigation, which clearly delineated that both nations would support each other. Actually, the Russian Empire became the first country in the world that received most favored nation status in commerce from the United States.
Okay, this is important.
Yes.
Say that again.
The Russian Empire was the first country in the world to receive most favored nation status from the United States.
Not Britain, not France, none of the old powers of the Europe. It was Russia.
It was Russia. That was very intentional. Again, from both the balance of trade and the prospects of growth,
of course,
which actually materialized. We're going to talk a little bit about that because it's important how that flowed into the events of the U.S. Civil War, but also the opposition of the other powers that were starting to meddle in the affairs of both Russia and the United States. It was very important. And by the way, that treaty that Buchanan designed and got the Tsar to sign, it was actually also not an easy conversation for Buchanan, because when he arrived, of course, President Jackson was in favor of tariffs.
Of course.
And the tariffs were affecting Russian goods.
Of course.
And the Russian side initially put up a diplomatic discourse stating that we need to resolve. It was resolved. The Treaty of 1832 lasted not 1 year, not two, not an administration, not two. Would you venture to guess how many years that treaty was in place?
No idea.
80 years. 80. It was so effective in providing what both nations needed.
All the way to the 20th century.
That's right. 80 years. Yeah. There was a new treaty that came in the administration of President Taft. We'll leave that aside.
Sure.
80 years.
80 years.
So on that foundation, things started to grow and to develop. Russia welcomed more and more Americans. And this is also important for how the United States emerged, evolved, and grew in its own stature. Because by that point in time, 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, the United States had a lot of entrepreneurship that resulted in invention. It resulted in technological progress. It was the age of the steam engines.
Yes.
The railroads. It was the age of the steamships that increased the speed of commerce and
Industrial
the ability.
revolution in America.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And although Russia was experiencing its own industrial revolution, it was behind. And Tsar Nicholas I realized that and welcomed Americans. One American that was welcomed with open arms, his name was George Washington Whistler.
Okay.
Now, some of our listeners, when they hear the last name Whistler, they may be thinking, especially those who are or have studied art, they may be thinking of the iconic image of Whistler's mother.
Mm-hmm.
One of the episodes of Mr. Bean actually makes fun of that.
Yes.
One of the greatest pieces of American artwork of all time.
Of course.
It has a connection to Russia, believe it or not, because in that portrait is Mrs. Whistler, the wife of the American engineer that was summoned to build the Moscow-St. Petersburg Railroad.
George Washington Whistler.
George Washington Whistler. And one of his sons was enrolled by the mom in the Russian Imperial Art Institution. And that's where he learned how to draw and how to paint and eventually created that iconic image.
Yes.
But back to George Washington Whistler, He established the standard for Russian railroads, exactly 5 feet. He came up with some innovative ideas on not only how to build a railroad and the locomotives, and by the way, Russia had nothing. So he had to establish factories to build everything, bridges to span the territory and such. After Whistler came others. The Russian fleet at the beginning of the Crimean War, the fleet in the Black Sea, most of the ships of the line, I think there were about a dozen of them, were actually made in the United States. And that actually came at a time when the US economy was, especially shipbuilding, was in a sort of a downward spiral. So Russian orders emboldened American shipbuilders to design ships that were better than the British ships.
So last time I remember,
yes,
you talked about Russian ships.
Yes.
Which, in fact, it was Russian tools,
yes,
nails,
yes,
ropes, and other things that they used in building American ship. And now this is American ships helping Russians.
Absolutely.
Buying more American ships.
Yes. And allowing Americans to experiment and build some of the largest ships of the time. The Kamchatka, for example, had a displacement of 2,500 tons. It was one of the biggest warships. And when the military attaché of Britain saw what was happening, he reported to London saying, this is becoming pretty scary because we used to rule the seas.
Yes, but
now the Tsar is arming himself with the help of the Americans, which actually helped the Americans in turn, not only to deliver what the Tsar wanted, but to sell to other countries.
Yes, and it started emerging as eventually a very powerful a naval power, eventually.
Naval, the railroad industry, new inventions, even funny things, right? The Tsar was a human, right? A person. He had his medical issues. So the inventor of gold fillings, an American, traveled to St. Petersburg to help the Tsar with his dental issues. But again, that was innovative. Yes, nobody had done that before. No. And of course, news spread that the Tsar would allow something like that. And that spread as a technology. The telegraph was emerging. And telegraph technology was spreading. And it was very interesting how plans were drawn up to connect the world, but to connect it to avoid Britain. They knew that if they would span the cables through Britain, Britain could hold the world hostage in communication. So a plan was drawn up to take the cables from the US East Coast across the Great Plains, up north through Alaska, Bering Strait, Siberia, and connect St. Petersburg. And both governments were working on that. So many wonderful things were happening that were providing new opportunities, but also giving confidence from both sides.
This brings me, as you talk about what happened in the past, I start thinking about today.
Yes.
We will get to that.
Yes.
I don't want to distract you from the main topic here, but it explains a lot of things that we witness today. In fact, Russia played a major role in supporting America, and also in order to protect her own interests, and it ended up creating a superpower here by bypassing Britain and holding them back to some extent and letting the United States to breathe.
Yes.
Very interesting.
That is an excellent point, Kourosh, because that is actually a wonderful assessment of what was happening. It allowed the United States to breathe at a time when Britain was at the height of its power and ambition. So if we look at the period between about 1840 and 1860, that is the height of the British Empire. The British Empire between that time had wars with China. It had a war with Russia. Of course, we know it as the Crimean War. Although, people think of Crimea as the main battlefield, true, but people tend to forget that the British and their allies, the French, attacked Russia from the other side. They attacked Kamchatka. They attacked the key naval base of Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky from the Pacific. They had that power and they had that ambition to, in essence, put the Tsar in a box.
Yes.
He was becoming too bold. They wanted to teach him a lesson. And at that same point in time, Britain was starting to scheme when it came to America. Of course, they tried in 1775, then in
Yes.
1812. And around 1840, 1850, there were attempts at subversion in the state of Maine, trying to instill some insurrection there.
Firebombing of Boston.
Oh, we're going to get to
Yeah,
Boston in a
okay.
second. That's a civil war, but actually closer to our home, and we're broadcasting from the Seattle area. There was the so-called Pig War. Do you remember that by any chance?
No.
It was a conflict over the San Juan Islands.
Oh, right here.
It was actually started by a pig. We're not going to go into all the
Okay.
details, but it was an armed engagement where the British were trying to send a message to the Americans. British Columbia and expansion in the West, and we're not too happy with the Americans doing the same. So at that time, Russia actually took the brunt of Britain's power in that Crimean War. What happened there? 1853, Britain allies with France, and they were trying to get Spain as an ally. And they attacked Russia. It was an invasion. Britain was actually quite concerned that the Tsar would go to Constantinople, where John Quincy Adams actually wanted him to go. Because if we look back at the 1820s, late 1820s, in 1827 to be precise, President John Quincy Adams addressed Congress, and he was speaking about many things in the world. And one thing that concerned him was that the Turks were suppressing the Greeks. And he referred to Congress saying, the Greeks, they taught us about democracy and how to build a republic, and now they are basically enslaved. They are subservient to the Turks. Well, guess what happened in 1828 to 1829? Russia went to war with Turkey, and Greece was liberated.
Ottoman at the time.
Yes,
Ottoman
Empire,
Yes.
of course, yes. But Greece was liberated. And that was much celebrated in the United States and by any nation that was supportive of liberty. So things like that were happening.
Very interesting. Wow. Okay.
So in terms of where we are, right, with that stature, Britain and France start the Crimean War. And the Crimean War does not go very well for the Tsars. And now was the time for the United States to step in and help. How? Diplomatically, and the threat of use of force. What happened? The United States wanted commerce to flow, and by that point in time, 2/3 of imports and exports out of Russia were carried on ships with the stars and stripes, with the American flag. The merchant fleet was still providing great service for the empire. The British wanted to blockade the Russians, and the President of the United States had to issue a threat. And actually, the Secretary of State gave the order to send part of the U.S. Navy into the Baltic Sea to protect the free flow of commerce, war notwithstanding. And that was received in Russia greatly, with great thanks. Because, for example, at that point in time, 80% of the cotton that Russia was using was coming from the United States. And that's important because we're getting to the Civil War. What was also very important were arms and munitions. Britain was trying to block that, but then a gentleman by the name of Samuel Colt, remember him? The inventor of the revolving gun, right? The revolver. Eventually the peacemaker that helped win the West and all that. Samuel Colt came to Russia's help. In 1854 and 1855, he actually traveled to Russia, and he would come back during the time of Alexander II. And not only did he smuggle guns, and not just a few pieces, there were reports of ships carrying 50,000 rifles and 100,000 pistols. He was also there to help with the technology. Again, American innovation, helping a backwards nation build up its armaments industry. Colt came with his engineers, he came with his designs, he came with the machinery, and at the famous Tula Arms Works, he helped them innovate. And actually, this is important because at the time of Peter the Great, Russia, a backwards nation, was looking to Europe for help in becoming more modern in innovation. From the 1840s onwards and up to the revolution of 1917, America became the place where Russia would look for innovation and help in technology and modernizing itself.
Isn't that interesting? Again, my mind tries to jump ahead.
That's okay.
But when you talk about how the United States supported Russia by providing guns, it just popped in my head, World War II and land lease, and how
yes.
the United States pretty much, isn't that history repeating itself in a different context, but it started supporting Russia or Soviet Union at the time to stand against Hitler.
Very much so. And before that, and it's a complex period, but still, it happened in a way where America was trying to support the democratic government of Russia in 1917, 1918.
Yes.
After the revolution. Ultimately, the communists won, but America did supply arms. And again, we're not going to go into the complexity of things, but America came to direct help numerous times.
Yes.
And it worked both ways. So we're fast approaching the Civil War, as I promised,
yes,
right?
Let's go there.
Let's talk about the period of the late 1850s and early 1860s. American diplomats actually reflected on how well-versed the Tsars were. One American diplomat recounted a conversation with the Empress of Russia, who was curious about literature and Fenimore Cooper and The Last of the Mohicans and all that.
Oh, yes.
But in the same vein, in conversation, she leaned over to the U.S. ambassador and said, "I'm very concerned about what is happening in your South. God forbid something happens to your nation because of the tension that was building there." Russia had its own tension. And the key point of tension in the United States and Russia was slavery.
Slavery, yes.
People tend to forget that in Russia, according to the census of 1858, 38% of the population, close to 40% of the population, were serfs, slaves.
Yes.
I'm a descendant of serfs. My ancestors were slaves. They were owned by landowners who exploited basically their labor and all that. And it was Alexander the First. Remember, we talked about how he was looking for examples from around the world. He actually started the discussion. And during his time, he allowed owners to free their serfs if they so wished. He did not decree it, but he started it. Nicholas I continued. He actually chartered a commission to look at how to do things. Fortunately, he passed away before he could do that. It was up to now Tsar Alexander II, who was also very open-minded and liberal and an intellectual who was trying to learn from the world, who chartered a commission in around 1859, and he made it a point to them. He said, "Enough with the back and forths. I want something concrete. How do we do this? We need to liberate 23 million people and not cause civil unrest in the process." And on March 1st of 1861, Russia did something that would pave the way, in a way, for the United States. The Emancipation Proclamation in Russia was published. It's interesting that some U.S. newspapers carried that information on April 12th of 1861. April 12th was Fort Sumter.
Yes.
The first shots of the Civil War. And this brings us to President Lincoln and another interesting character. This whole history between Russia and the United States is full of very colorful and powerful characters.
Yes.
The character I'm about to mention, his name was Cassius Marcellus Clay.
Cassius Marcellus Clay.
Now, to some of our viewers and to some of our listeners, they are probably also going, where did I hear that name fairly recently in history? Cassius Marcellus Clay Jr. was the given name of Muhammad Ali.
Muhammad Ali, before he converts to Islam. Yes.
He was the grandson of a slave that was freed by Cassius Marcellus Clay.
Yes. Cassius
Marcellus Clay was...
Excuse me.
Yes.
He was also a boxer, wasn't he? Cassius Marcellus Clay, or no?
Even more than a boxer. And we're going to get to that. Although, if you look at his memoirs, he very specifically wrote a number of times. He said, "I don't want to be remembered for my fighting skills. I want to be remembered for my skills as a diplomat and somebody who convinced people to change their ways," which he did.
He did.
He was the cousin of Henry Clay, who was Secretary of State, and because of that, he was introduced to President Jackson and Van Buren as a young man, a graduate of Yale, who decided that although he inherited a fortune, slaves and plantations in Kentucky, he would liberate them.
Yeah.
It was his own heart and his own soul that told him this was not right.
Yeah.
And he liberated everybody. He offered the African Americans employment. He offered them to stay in their homes, to stay on the plantations, but to be paid fairly for their labor, or they could go free. Actually, one of the very first independent colleges in this country that accepted anybody of any race, of any color, any creed, a Berea College, was founded in the city of Berea, to which Cassius Marcellus Clay donated a piece of his land, a piece of his property. And he took it further. He decided not to end at his own inheritance, but he actually spoke, and he spoke eloquently. He became an elected official, and he used that platform, the podium, to spread the message of abolition. Yeah. Something that was extremely dangerous at the time. And he became so widely known and known as a firebrand of the time. Yes. That
politically incorrect, perhaps, for his time.
Absolutely incorrect. Yes. He was basically inciting something that many around him wanted stopped in the most radical way. So a hired assassin by the name of Sam Brown, who it was recorded had 40 fights to the death and did not lose a single one, obviously. Oh. Sam Brown was hired by opponents of Cassius Marcellus Clay to confront him. And as Cassius was delivering one of his fiery speeches, the man fired a pistol, a bullet into the chest of Cassius Marcellus Clay. Not only did Clay survive, but he took his Bowie knife and he cut his assailant, threw him over a fence, only to be confronted by the members of the audience who beat him with sticks and with chairs and everything, and he survived that.
And he always carried that Bowie knife.
That's actually what saved him, because when the shot was aimed at his chest, it actually hit part of the knife, and the bullet did not penetrate. But of course, still very traumatic. A few years later, when he was publishing his newspaper called The True American, again, using the media, using the press, the freedom of the press to spread the word. It was all about abolition and things in the North as opposed to things in the South. He actually had to reinforce his facility with 2 cannons that was placed inside because people would come from time to time and try to burn the place down. Eventually, he confronted 6 brothers that were intent to kill him. And at one point in the battle, one of the brothers brought a gun to Cassius Marcellus's head and clicked it 3 times.
Russian roulette.
Fortunately, that gun probably wasn't a Colt design or a Russian design. It failed. Wow. And in April of 1861, Cassius, who had known President Lincoln from the time when Lincoln was just an up-and-coming politician, actually, Cassius grew up as a teenager with Mary Todd Lincoln, the first lady. Wow, they just knew each other. It just so happened. So in April of 1861, Cassius was actually coming to Washington, D.C. because he thought that President Lincoln would thank him for his political support. And during the Chicago convention of the Republican Party, Cassius spoke in favor of Lincoln as being the candidate. Cassius thought that he would be Secretary of War. Instead, Lincoln made him ambassador to Russia. But only after Cassius Marcellus Clay did a great service to this nation. Again, April 12th, Fort Sumter. It is recorded that on April 17th, the president was with the First Lady and their 3 sons on the 2nd story of the White House. And they were looking across the Potomac River, and they were looking at the state that was the most powerful state of the opposition, of the Confederacy. Yes. And Lincoln wrote in his diary, "The Carolinians are coming. They're moving through Virginia. Who's going to stop them?" And the reason he wrote that, because for whatever reason, there were no federal troops in Washington, D.C. at that point in time. Nobody. Cassius Marcellus shows up. He thinks he's going to get an appointment. he figures out that he needs to raise a militia. So he found 300 able men that formed basically outposts around the naval yards and the White House until other troops could arrive. Lincoln thanked him and said, "You are headed to Russia because it is very, very important that you get there."
And when you think about it, his role in that moment was huge, and he just rise to the point, and he bring these people together to support president. And you would think president will send him to be one of his most important ambassadors to a country that needs friendship with the United States. So sending him to Russia sounds very important when we look at it in hindsight today.
Absolutely. And here's the criticality of things. What Lincoln and his government, William Seward, who was the Secretary of State, understood was that the conflict that is typically looked at as an internal affair of the United States between the North and the South, and the conflict was based on economic reasons, basically, and slavery was at the heart of the matter. It was not an internal affair. There were powerful forces that were looking at it as an opportunity to, again, go in, divide, and conquer
again.
And that was Great Britain, and that was France. France from the south, Napoleon III had ambition in Mexico and expansion from those territories and meddling in the south and maybe Louisiana back and all that stuff. And Britain from the north. Britain had reinforced its bases around Halifax and other parts of Canada. And the Admiralty, as you recalled, Kurosh, a few minutes ago, actually drew up plans. British Prime Minister Lord Palmerston actually commissioned those plans, and the records exist that there was an effort to send a British flotilla with ships of the line and frigates to specifically firebomb Boston, but more importantly, New York, because it was, of course, the financial capital of the United States and its importance. Britain was planning to use the Great Eastern, which was the biggest ship in the world, which would at one time transport 4,000 redcoats easily across the Atlantic to reinforce the forces. And the only thing that stopped Britain and stopped France was actually Russia.
Yes.
Now, this fact has been disputed by some historians, especially British historians, who say that the appearance of the Russian Navy at a critical time, and we're talking about the autumn of 1863, August, September of 1863, a number of Lincoln's generals lose key battles. In one instance, 17,000 soldiers killed, wounded, missing in action. Another instance, 18,000 soldiers killed and wounded. And Lincoln is also very concerned not only on land, but also on sea. The Confederate raiders, the marauders, those ships, which were, by the way, built in Britain and in France, they, during the Civil War, destroyed close to 1,000 ships that the North was using for its own commerce and trade. 1,000 were sunk by these warships. Unfortunately, at that point in time, the U.S. Navy did not have major resources. So when the Tsar sent his Navy to New York in September of 1863 and San Francisco in October of 1863, it was received as basically a godsend.
Of course.
Now, what was happening in the background? Britain and France actually approached the Tsar, and they were trying to figure out whether the Tsar would just step aside and allow things to progress the way they wanted, or perhaps would even join with them in doing what? Britain and France were on the verge of recognizing the Confederacy as a separate nation. They were trying to broker peace talks to bring two sides, two belligerents, which would have given legitimacy to the Southerners as a separate state or set of states, separate government. The Tsar said no. The United States, as we know it, are a union They have an issue, but we will not support any separate activity there. It's interesting that Britain and France actually, in early 1863, they turned to the United States. And covertly, they approached Secretary of State Seward and said, oh, the Tsar has some problems in Poland right now, which they inspired actually as a rebellion.
Yes.
Why don't you join us? And we can intervene in Poland to teach the Tsar a lesson. To which Seward immediately said, never. The Russian Empire has been a consistent friend of the United States, and it will remain so. So from both sides, those overtures...
To break this alliance between Russia and America.
Oh, yes. Divide and conquer again.
Yes.
So both sides, Russia and America, rejected those attempts to break up the alliance.
And this is only 2 years after the Crimean War.
Oh, no. Crimean War was 1853 to 1856.
Okay.
So this is about 5 years.
5 years.
5 years. And actually, the Crimean War, thank you for bringing us back there for just a second. It's important because the Crimean War was devastating.
Sure. Dozens
of the Tsar's ships were on the bottom of the Black Sea. The British had, and the French had inflicted a lot of loss to the military power. In the meantime, in the 5 years, a lot of the Russian Navy was actually rebuilt in America.
Yeah.
And when Admiral Stepan Lisovsky showed up in New York, September of 1863, and Admiral Andrei Popov shows up in San Francisco in October of 1863, part of the ships that they were on and the guns were American-made. And both admirals actually had friends on the East Coast and the West Coast, respectively, because when it comes to Popov, that was his third trip to San Francisco. He had been there numerous times and, again, on very friendly occasions. But as I referred to, the way that some historians portray why did the fleet arrive in the United States, they talk about this conflict around Poland and the fact that the British could have bottled up the Tsar's navy in the Baltic. Yep. Part of it is true, but historical records that I was able to uncover in the tens of thousands of pages that I went through in writing my own book, America's Arch Ally, yes. Russia's Forgotten Role in the Founding, Development, and Defense of the United States, the historical records are clear. And some of those records are actually not only with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Russia, but also in the Department of State in the United States. Because 2 U.S. ambassadors and also the American representative for the Russian Empire who was handling all the financial accounts were actually shown the letters from Britain. They were shown the letters from Napoleon III, and they were shown the official responses from Alexander. And they were also shown the orders that were given to the admirals. And the orders were very explicit. If the Russian fleet that is now based in the United States finds itself under fire or learns that there is a war breaking out, now a global war with Britain yes. or France involved, they are to report directly to President Lincoln. And the U.S. Navy will command where the Russian ships and sailors and guns go.
So they put them at the president's disposal, literally.
Yes, yes. And President Lincoln, of course, unfortunately passed away tragically. We don't have his own memoirs, but we do have the recollections of those who he spoke to. And there's the recollection of a congressman from the state of Illinois who was a close confidant of Lincoln's who says Lincoln was in disbelief when he learned that not only did the fleet arrive, but the orders were very clear that he could command them if shots were fired. Mary Todd Lincoln, the First Lady, she traveled to New York. She was part of the group of ecstatic American citizens that were in New York Harbor. And it wasn't just one ship. It was actually quite a flotilla, both in New York Harbor and in San Francisco. One of the ships that arrived in New York was the largest ships ever to go through Hell's Gate in New York at that point in time. It was a very formidable force. And there was jubilation. People were crying out, the Russians are here. The Russians are here. We're saved. Again, in the darkest hour. And it is said that President Lincoln was so inspired by this that he made an indirect reference to what had happened in his first proclamation of Thanksgiving the first proclamation ever of the President of the United States. It was a moving time. Now, what were the Russians prepared to do? They were prepared not only to sit idly, but to engage in combat. And it came very close because there was news of Confederate raiders not only up and down the Atlantic coast and threatening New York, and of course the British, who never showed up, by the way.
No.
They knew that the Russians were already there. The plans the Admiralty had were never put in play. But it was also on the West Coast. And the West Coast is very important because of the economy of the United States and the discoveries in the state of California and Nevada of what? Gold and silver.
Gold, yes.
At that point in time, the Confederacy had about $27 million worth in those dollars, right?
Of course.
Much more powerful dollars in the day. About $27 million worth of gold specie. Just in California, the Union had about $173 million worth of gold. Something that the raiders and the marauders would have wanted to plunder.
Definitely.
So what was going on in San Francisco? Unfortunately for the U.S., and San Francisco was the biggest city at the time, but was also a fairly remote outpost, not connected by the transatlantic railroad that didn't exist, so remote location. The whole of San Francisco only had 6 wooden ships. I'm sorry, the whole U.S. Navy in the Pacific, the whole Pacific Ocean only had 6 wooden ships. And the gunboat that was assigned to protect San Francisco had been sunk by October of 1863. So when the Russian armada arrived, it was again jubilation.
Of course.
Because a few days prior, the citizens of San Francisco were woken up in the middle of the night before dawn with gunfire, not rifles, artillery pieces. As citizens were going out to sea, they saw the silhouette of a warship going through the Golden Gate and entering the bay, a warship that could potentially threaten the city. The commander of the outpost on Alcatraz signaled to the ship. There was no response in the dark, so he fired shots across the bow, the international signal that I'm prepared to fire at you. Only then did the ship raise the Union Jack. The captain of the ship started sending signals to the coast saying, I'm a British warship, and why are you firing at me? Before the Americans could respond and saying, well, there are rules and we are at war. Yeah. You should have identified yourself earlier. The ship disappeared. So to our listeners and viewers, maybe somebody can do some research in the Admiralty. What was that ship doing there?
Exactly.
Why?
And raise the Union flag.
Union Jack.
Union Jack.
The British flag.
Union
it was flying.
Jack,
the Union Jack. No, it was flying the British colors. Yeah. But what was it doing? It was probing for something. Yeah.
So Britain at the time wanted to support Confederacy.
Yes.
And participate in the war and split the United States.
Yes.
And at the same time, France was also thinking about doing something.
Yes.
But they never came together just like they did in the Crimean War against Russia. So there was a split, conflict of interest, or whatever it was.
No.
What was the reason they didn't come together? Was it part of it because France was trying to install someone in Mexico, which I think they ended up installing Maximilian I there. So what was the dynamic there that these two powers, always ready to divide and conquer, failed to come in and participate?
While they did have conflicting interests in North, South America, or to the south of the U.S. border somewhat, they were actually united in that attempt to divide and conquer and inflict damage on the United States of America. They were definitely pro-Confederacy, both of them. They were definitely against Lincoln's Union. And they were looking and probing at vulnerabilities, just like that ship that I just described in San Francisco. And the only deterrent, the only military aid that the United States received against these two powerful nations
from Russia
was the Russian Navy, because it was publicized very soon after that mysterious British warship left and never to reappear again. And by the way, there were also reports of Confederate raiders going along the western coast and threatening San Francisco. They never showed up. And here's why. Admiral Popov publicly spoke to one of the prominent citizens of San Francisco, and the newspapers picked up and published that story. And the question was, Admiral, we are fearful because we have no defenses. What if a warship approaches our shores and starts firebombing our city, setting it ablaze? What are you going to do?
Yeah.
Tell us. And Popov famously answered, I would not only give you my ships, my guns, my ammunition, and my men, but I will go myself, and I will fight on your behalf. I will protect you. And that was a message that was intentionally sent. Popov actually broadcast that message to all ships approaching San Francisco so that they would know that intent. And speaking of fires, unfortunately, in late 1863, there was a very serious fire in the financial district of San Francisco. And the local firefighters fought the blaze. And of course, back to the days, right? Wooden buildings, and it spreads, and some of the machinery failed. Humans started failing just out of exhaustion. And the citizens were looking at trepidation of, are we going to lose our whole city? And then they started cheering because they saw boat upon boat, thousands of Russian sailors moved on shore, ran to relieve the firefighters and save the city of San Francisco from destruction. 6 of them died, unfortunately. Many others were injured and wounded, but they were selfless because they were there. They were helping their American friends.
I want to thank you for being so precise, accurate, and bringing these kind of stories to our conversation. Supposedly, a group of foreigners, they come to the rescue of the people of San Francisco. And I was talking to a friend, and without disclosing his name, he's sort of very popular and famous. And he said, the fact is, Russians always loved America, love America, and have been very loyal to America, regardless of whatever happened in politics. So those people, they run to the rescue. It's their choice.
Yes.
It's their choice.
Yes.
That reminded me sort of like Dunkirk. Yes. Everybody on a boat goes to save, and you have similar thing here. Thank you. Thank you for bringing that story to us. So I think we should, it's worth to spend one whole episode on the character of Cassius Marcellus Clay. Do you agree?
Oh, perhaps. And I'd leave it up to our viewers and listeners if they would like me to talk more about him.
Had a very colorful life, and also a man bigger than life itself. So
absolutely.
Getting into what he did in Russia, his role in getting Russia to support the Union, yes, and all the political and diplomatic importance that his work had, and also a very interesting personal life.
Very
interesting,
dramatic.
I think we should make a promise our viewers that we just give him one full episode.
Oh, I would love to if there is interest. Actually, one of the biographies that I read, and there are a number of books that were written by historians who researched them very thoroughly. I benefit from reading all of that. One of the books is actually called A Man Seen Only But Once. Another one is called The Last Gladiator.
Wow.
Is a description of him. But Krush, if I may, before we wrap this episode, sort of a bookend to the stories, 1878. So, of course, we started a couple of episodes in 1775, right? We are 100 years into this relationship.
Yes.
1878, the war hero of the Civil War, Ulysses S. Grant.
Yes.
General who helped save the Union, and former president of the United States, travels to St. Petersburg, and he's greeted very warmly by Tsar Alexander II. He is treated to dinner and conversation in which Alexander II responds to the thanks from the American for all the help and all the support very warmly and says, always, as long as I live, I pledge to you that we will be on the best of terms and I will always support you.
Great story. This is great. Thank you very much. I think we leave our viewers and listeners with this until our next episode. Thank you very much. So we talked about important subject that you discussed is 1861 Emancipation Proclamation
Yes.
in Russia,
Yes.
when Alexander II
Yes.
freed the serfs.
Yes.
And that was very strange when you said that the percentage of the population, they were serf,
Yes. 38%.
38%. And then 1961 to 65, we have American Civil War.
Yes.
1963 was American, if I'm not mistaken, Emancipation Proclamation, and the U.S. was 1963.
That is correct. It was published in the end of 1862,
Yeah.
which infuriated the South. It became effective in January 1st of 1863. So 2 years after the Russians did it,
Exactly.
Lincoln
That's
followed
what I
suit.
was going. Exactly.
Yes. And actually, Cassius Marcellus Clay influenced that.
And Cassius Marcellus, yes,
Uh-huh.
the Kentuckian, and that great man.
Yeah.
So and we discussed all the little things, little events, which they may be small events, but they made major roles in what this country became after putting all those days, dark days behind,
Yes.
having a great friend
Mhm.
like Russia at the time. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you all for watching and listening. We'll be back next episode with more talks. And Al is going to introduce to us even more interesting characters and events in history. Until then, thank you very much. God bless you all. Bye.